Hello again, everybody. Happy Friday, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Blumira Briefings, your download of the week's most important headlines with some added context to actually make it useful to you. We're celebrating an Oops All Detection Engineers episode today, which will be fun. I am joined by my teammates Jake and Justin. Gents, you want to say hi to everybody?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Jake with the detection engineering team, and the Oops All Detection Engineer episode is the best flavor of episode, in my opinion.
I'm excited about it because I think like we've got a couple of stories looking at tactics and tools where I think you guys are going to be able to add a lot of context. And Justin?
Yep, I'm Justin. I work with Jake. I'm also a detection engineer.
So we're going to dive right in. We've got a few security updates on critical updates you may want to be aware of. The first one is a different Cisco credential vulnerability than the one that we talked about last week or a couple of weeks ago. This one is affecting cloud platforms, specifically AWS, Azure, and Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. And the issue is that the way that credentials are generated in new deployments results in the same credentials being generated if they are on the same platform and running the same software version, which obviously opens up the risk of an attacker opening an instance on the same platform if they know the software version. They potentially, if those credentials have not been changed and the ports to log into them are open, could potentially gain access to other deployments. This has gotten a CVE 2025-2286 and a 9.9 score. Being classified as a hard-coded password. I think that the Cisco advisory refers to it as a static credential vulnerability. There is no provided mitigation at this point. However, Cisco has applied a patch. So you can limit login from source IPs. You can also reapply, basically reset the configuration file after that in a deployment after that patch to generate a new set of credentials. So, gents, this is, I think, the third or the fourth hard-coded or insecure credential story we've seen just in the last several weeks. In this case, at least they can be changed versus permanently hard-coded. I mean, is this a better argument in favor of segmenting and limited kind of across the board all remote admin interfaces? And while we're on the topic, what are some other good cloud-based best practices that teams, especially those new to the cloud, can often overlook?
Yeah, I actually had a ton of notes on this particular article, so I'll try to distill them down as much as I can. But I wanted to note that there was some proof of code or proof of concept code that is allegedly out in the wild. I couldn't find anything, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I mostly wanted to see it because I was a little unclear about what they meant by it seemed like the proof of concept code was to extract the credentials, and then the actual vulnerability was that you could reuse those credentials, or it was a little unclear in that way. But I wasn't sure how they were actually figuring out what those randomized credentials were. I get that they can reuse them elsewhere. I wasn't sure how they got their hands on them, so that I'm a little unclear of. But yeah, I thought it was funny they referred to it as a static credential vulnerability. That's just another way to say hard coded credentials one way or another.
Yeah.
And I guess the real concern here is basically that if one device is compromised, you could potentially have any other device. So this is not restricted to just your org. If another org gets popped, that credential could be used on your org if you use the same version on the same provider. And I also wanted to be clear too, because not everybody might know what the ISE is for, but it's the Cisco specifically explains it as it's a next generation NAC, which is a network access control solution. So it's just something to kind of validate and verify users and endpoints as they're logging in. It's like I said, network access control. So it's preventing unknown or unexpected devices or people from logging on or connecting to a network. So if someone's able to compromise that, they can easily blast a hole or do something to compromise that device and allow themselves some kind of access further into the network, and then come in through that way. So it's a good persistence mechanism. Once you exploit that, you can make a rule or something to allow yourself in. Um, and the biggest thing too is like, randomly generated or not, I feel like default cred should always be changed. These randomly generated creds are just default creds with extra steps, in my opinion. Like, they're not really fooling anyone here. We don't have any insight into how these creds are being randomly generated. It could be very, and obviously it must be, but it could be very like just basic code, or actually not randomized, which is like what I think we're finding here. So it's kind of like a coin toss, but even if they are randomly generated, you should be going in just as like your normal deployment is like, I'm going to switch this to something that only I know and that only I've documented somewhere. And that's just one of those like very basic first steps. I've got a few more, but I also don't want to hog the mic. So if it has any points for securing or hardening cloud infrastructure like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, when I was reading through this, it screamed like tech debt. Like some developer somewhere had put this in to probably test or iterate more quickly. Um, Developers who are using any sort of secrets inside of code, if they're hard coded, you need to follow best practices. Go beyond the obfuscation, go towards encryption and best practices out that are freely available out there. But that was the first thing that I thought of. The other thing too is with anything that that has access to the network, like what Jake was saying, if it has some sort of remote admin interface, definitely make sure it's not exposed externally. I think your point, Zoe, about network segmentation, I mean, there's so many options out there, um, even free options too, like to call it a few, like Tailscale and Twingate can be used to secure these interfaces as well. I think with the options that are available, like the workarounds are given. I know Jake has mentioned this in the past too, like seeing that there are workarounds if you're not able to patch quickly, or just to have more options is always a good thing to see from a vendor as well. So I do want to give them props on that.
And I do want to add one detail from the story that I forgot to say when I was doing the review. This vulnerability will be relevant on cloud primary administration nodes. So if we're talking about a deployment that is not a primary administration node, or that primary administration node is local and hosted within the local environment, that is not, according to the advisory, affected by this bug. So I do want to make sure to clarify that. We always try and make sure to ground the scary news and put it as accurately as possible. So next up, on the topic of patches for critical vulnerabilities, there was a June security patch day from SAP, included 14 fixes, including a critical bug affecting NetWeaver. There is the source article for this is a summary from research firm Onapsis, to give them credit. I tried going to the release notes on SAP, but those are login walled. You need to have an account in order to view them. So I had to go through the Onapsis summary there. So shout out to them for doing a good accessible write-up that folks can take a look at. And this RFC flaw is that under certain conditions, authenticated attackers can bypass the standard authorization check on auth object S_RFC when using transactional or queued RFCs, which would lead to an escalation of privileges that allows an attacker to critically impact the application's integrity and availability. That CVE 2025-42989 is classified as a missing authorization bug in NetWeaver and has a 9.6 CVSS score. There are 4 other high priority fixes ranging from 8.8 to, I believe, 7.6. Full details we'll have in the article link. But I want to, and in terms of mitigations included in the update notes, it said that it may require assigning additional SRFC permissions to some users. I know that missing auth errors as a category of vulnerability can impact every part of the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability triangle, as well as access control. In this case, the advisory warns that exploit could affect integrity and availability specifically. So can we talk about some of the factors that'll influence the severity of missing bugs, or even authentication bugs more broadly like this? I know that we've talked about CVS scoring before, but it's been some times. We likely have some new viewers, so it'd probably be good to do a refresh.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the CVSS scoring, because that was exactly the first thing that I went to when I was reading these notes, and looking at the questions we were asking. I think specifically for this, like without considering CVSS, understanding the severity of an auth error like this depends highly on what access the person, the attacker, lands with. If they're able to elevate their permissions and kind of like get in as an admin and make whatever changes they want, that's obviously a little bit more severe than maybe just a user or maybe some like read-only service account. But obviously, too, going to the CVSS score is really good at laying out. And this is the whole reason we have the CVSS score, is not only to assign numbers and give us an idea of how severe something is, but it also, if you look into the score and how it's made, it tells you a little bit of the attack, what's required, like all the ingredients for the attack. And specifically, like just to name off of a few that are really easy to like explain, would be like the first one is attack vector. So they break that down by network, adjacent network, local, or physical. So that means like all these different ways. Can they access it remotely? Do they need to be on the local network to access it? Can they be on a network like through the VPN and access it that way? Attack complexity is another one. Is it easy? Is it hard to initiate this attack? Like maybe it's a string of attacks, a string of exploits that's required, and maybe like somewhere in the middle of that string, it's very unreliable and sometimes it crashes. That's entirely possible too. So I would advise people, and I'll post this, I'll make sure I put it in the resources for the episode. But I would encourage people just to look at base score metrics for CVSS and how things are scored. And you can start to see, like, when you see a CVSS come up or like a new CVE, look at the CVSS score and then look at how it's broken down and how each section is labeled. And it gives you a very quick idea of like, okay, they need to be local, they need to have admin credentials to get in, they need to have XYZ. That's what CVSS is really good for, and it will tell you all of those things. And through that, you'll be able to understand, like, okay, what does this mean to me? So yeah, CVSS is big here for understanding severity and this kind of thing.
Well, I know you're going to have some input here as we move on to our most changed trends this week. So we have been going through the top trending in each of the categories across threats, suspects, and risks. Many of those stay the same week to week. We continue to see remote desktop tools like Splashtop and LogMeIn, suspicious file deletions. Those are relatively, they move around in position, but we see mostly the same findings come back week after week. So we're going to start taking a look at some of the most changed trends. So this is the greatest increase or decrease in activity across the categories that we've seen over the last 14 days, the last week and then the prior week. Starting with our threats category, we've got an indicator of AWS, guard duty, critical IAM, anomalous behavior. Another AWS alert for CloudTrail, impaired defenses, disabling guard duty. We have a malicious web shell connection to an external IP. A call out to a 2023 CVE 21554 for QJumper. Jake, I know you noted that that's one you want to comment on. So just a reminder, threats are those that we have a high level of confidence represent malicious activity. It's the most severe category of finding that we have, basically those that we say should be investigated ASAP. What kind of stands out of these lists? Most of these are new, meaning that we've seen only this week's activity in those categories. So these are infrequent findings that are being triggered across customers. Although we did see over a doubling in registry dumps of SAM. So thoughts on this threat category?
Yeah, so for the threats, out of all of the top 10, I picked three that really stuck out to me as like little red flags or just things to come back to. One of them was, as you said, Zoe, the Q jumper. That was the CVE 2023 21554. That detection was specifically looking for accepted external connections to the MQ service.exe. And that was an indicator of compromise for that specific CVE. I thought this one was interesting, or at least worth talking about, just to kind of say, like, just because something's older, like, I wouldn't even say 2023 is an older exploit. But even if something's older, doesn't mean you shouldn't be like looking for it and making sure you've got patches for it. So that's just kind of like like I don't have any specific comments about QJumper specifically, but just a good reminder of like a lot of attackers were seeing everybody APTs. They don't care when an exploit came out. They could care less. They're going to exploit it if it's exploitable. So just because it's older, don't discount it. The other one that came out or point out to me was came in at number 8 here, Cobalt Strike. So Cobalt Strike, if anybody's unfamiliar with it, is a penetration testing platform that is I don't even like I know there's a lot of legitimate penetration testers that use it, but again, I think they also like using it because so many threat actors use it. So it generates a lot of like realistic logs because Cobalt Strike is one of those platforms that has just gotten completely taken over by threat actors. They're stealing keys to it. They're doing all sorts of things, and they're using it all the time in their attacks. It's one of the top most popular, alongside like Sliver is another one, and Meterpreter out of Metasploit is also another one that's in the same vein. And those three right there are probably some of the most common that are used. Brute Retell is another one that's the same idea, penetration testing platform that is now being abused. But yeah, and then the last one, number 9, was suspicious OneNote attachment execution. This one stuck out to me because, one side of the coin, Office suite applications are like constantly being abused in one way or another by attackers, because it's one of those things that almost like antivirus, you could assume that most Windows users are using like the Office suite. It's almost a guaranteed, at least, especially if like you're in a business environment. It's just so widespread. So they use those applications to hide things like excuse me, they use those things to hide things like macros for like Excel, and there's all sorts of different like exploits you could use in Office Suite itself, and OneNote is no exception to that. And a lot of those exploits aren't always things that are being patched. Some of them are even ones that Microsoft kind of like does the hand wavy, where it's like it's supposed to perform that way. We're not going to do any patching on it. So Office suite applications doing weird things, spawning weird processes is something we should always be on the lookout for.
Moving into the suspects category, again, these are findings that might represent legitimate activity. We don't have that 98% plus confidence that it represents a malicious attack, but it is very suspicious and should also be a priority to investigate. All of these are new surges just in the last week. Up on the list, we've got a renamed PowerShell, custom admin role created in Google Workspace. Advanced port scanner comes up a ton in enumeration discussions. Suspected AZ copy execution. There's our Screen Connect. Usually we take turns at which remote access tool shows up in the top. So we've got one in the most changed this week too. A large amount of total authentications in a null session, and then Palo Alto 100% CPU usage, which can often be an indicator of unexpected activity or resource misuse. Thoughts on these ones?
Yeah. And actually, too, one of the ones that sticks out to me is the Google Workspace custom admin role created.
Yeah,
Um,
same.
Identities are hot, and they're going to continue to be hot as we've seen the consolidation of the identity in the enterprise and business environments. I did also want to briefly touch on under the threats category that I feel like this is related to the AWS Guard Duty Critical IAM anomalous behavior detection up there too. Um, Keeping an eye on your IAM policies, leveraging all the tools available to you for whatever identity provider you're using, whether it's AWS, Azure, Google Workspace slash GCP, um, is a best practice, and you should be doing it, especially if you're using those identities across multiple services and systems. Um, if somebody gets into one of those identities, it's very easy for them to pivot to the other services that those identities have access to. And so those were the first ones. And it's also a common cloud misconfiguration to creating these custom admin roles for Google Workspace in particular. I know Jake had also chosen to call out the AWS Guard Duty existing S3 bucket publicly exposed. This has gotten some major enterprises in the past, like for instance, Verizon. So, just keeping in mind, I know in AWS is probably my least favorite one to talk about just because it's like everything requires like 7 different JSON files that you have to manage. But if you have a way to consolidate and audit these things, I probably talk about auditing more than I talk about the actual threats and vulnerabilities. It feels like the last few sessions we've had. But it's really the name of the game. You have to get visibility into all of these things, not just the logs.
I think it's a good reminder that a lot of times the most important and effective security maintenance is sometimes the most boring, but that is why it can be most effective, is that it's easy to overlook and push off in favor of looking at the new and exciting threats and attacks. I think S3 bucket misconfigurations is a great example of the issues that folks can run to when they are moving to cloud-based resources with a perimeterized local framework, right? These are things that if they existed in a local environment would be behind your firewall, would be sort of in that crunchy on the outside, chewy on the inside traditional arrangement. But now I think we've crossed the threshold where it's less likely to see an entirely local environment than some amount of balance between local and hosted resources, which I think is driving a lot of why we see identity as such a driving focus of attackers, is that's going to be your keys. And now rather than pivoting on a insecure or unpatched device, if you can find that weak identity, it gives you a lot more options where you can pivot.
Yeah, I'll harp on the S3 bucket one as well, just because this one catches everybody, and it's not because anyone's doing anything stupid. It's just, I mean, and I'm sure there's cases like that, but more often than not, like I'll give people the benefit of the doubt on this one. Like I'm personally, like I know a lot about AWS, but like there's a lot of like even just configuring S3 buckets, like there's not I get confused all the time with that kind of stuff. I'm not sure what I'm clicking on half the time. And sometimes I'm just trying to get something as like a test, and even that alone is hard. And then before I know it, that test thing is turning into a production thing. That's not anything I've done here at Blumira, but like just saying like you can make something that's like, oh, I'm just gonna do this for a test purpose, and I'll bring it down later. But then all of a sudden, like I don't know, you go away for a week, and then people are all of a sudden using it for production. So it's just one that catches people, not only because they might not know what they're opening, but it also AWS doesn't make it exactly clear like what it means to have a public bucket. I mean, it's kind of in the name, but you almost assume that like, oh, they wouldn't let me do that. But yeah, they would actually let you post things publicly and publicly accessible. And then I wanted to mention too, the only other one I wanted to focus on was the AZ copy, and just how that's used, because not everybody might be familiar with that, but it's a CLI tool that lets you copy blobs and files to or from a storage account for like Azure services. And this is used by attackers for exfil purposes. So they'll use AZ copy to move stuff around, move it out of your infrastructure to their infrastructure, or just um, make things like go from your network where you protect it outside of the network, and they can use that for extortion or whatever else.
Yeah. And just to add on to that too, Jake, some of the comments you made kind of inspired me too. When we're talking about configuring resources in your preferred cloud provider, whether it's GCP or whether it's Azure or AWS, oftentimes the default settings are the incorrect settings. Just like when you get like a firewall sent to you and you're doing the first configuration, there's usually a default password. A lot of times, I'm not sure if they've done it recently, but I remember in the past, sometimes even like the public option was a default setting. So if you aren't already doing some sort of like infrastructure as code or have that sort of review process internally, it is a good idea to at least get a second set of eyes just to make sure that everything is good. Because, like Jake said, it's usually not because of someone being dumb and doing something or someone having like malicious internal intent or something like that. It's usually just a case of you have to get all these things going as fast as humanly possible, and you're not able to see everything on the page sometimes, or maybe you're just moving too quick or something like that. So yeah, definitely getting a review process or adopting like an infrastructure or cloud services as code sort of thing is usually a good thing to adopt, and that way you get version control too. Everyone likes version control.
Moving into our general security news, there was a CISA alert along with a Microsoft advisory warning of a Windows ODE used in attack on a major Turkish defense org. This was a WebDAV based vulnerability, CVE 2025 33053, which has been actively exploited by the Stealth Falcon APT group and leveraged against a Turkish defense organization. This was allowing remote execution by tricking users into clicking malicious URLs. And Jake, you made a great point on this because I got the heads up on this news story just this morning that this is not a bypass trying to reach WebDAV resources on the victim side. This is a misuse of WebDAV to run files that the attacker is serving up through WebDAV, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So if anybody's unfamiliar with WebDAV, it basically makes like a web server acts like a file server. So if you have WebDAV enabled on a server, like a web server, you browse to that WebDAV resource on that server, you'll be met with like directories, and it's just like a file browser, file explorer at that point. So yeah, the idea behind this attack was essentially they will maliciously craft a URL, which if that's another thing that's weird too is like it's not a URL itself, but a URL file, which was used here. And if nobody's seen what those look like, URL files themselves can actually have some config saved in them, and that's being like the URL they're pointing to. Other things such as like working directory and some other configs in there. That's something I haven't quite dug into too much, but I just wanted to be clear. Like URL files are not just URLs; they have some information in them as well. And basically, they're taking that URL file, and in this case, or at least the case that I think Checkpoint came up with or found, was it was a URL file that was disguised as a PDF file. So this is something that we've also been talking about recently with file masquerading, but they basically made it look like the URL was a PDF file by doing .pdf.url. So it is actually a URL file, just masquerading as a PDF file. That was what tricked somebody into opening it. And then that URL file, what they did to make it malicious was the thing they're targeting here is this is going to be like super weird, but like the process itself is IE diagcmd.exe, which is just a diagnostic utility for Internet Explorer. But one of the things that diag utility does is when it runs some commands in the background, some processes in the background. One of those specifically is the route.exe process, which is another legitimate baked in utility to Windows. And how they abused that was basically they took that internet shortcut, that URL shortcut file, they changed the working directory inside that config file to point to their WebDAV, their attacker controlled WebDAV. So they're hosting this WebDAV with this file, and the file that's hosted there is also called route.exe. So when the IE diag CMD starts, it's going to use that working directory, and it's going to say, okay, I'm looking for route.exe. And instead of using the one that's baked into your Windows, it uses the one that the attacker is hosting. And then that can be whatever the heck they want. You could just take any old executable and rename it route.exe, and it's going to be used. So they're probably using that for like interpreter shells or some kind of shell to get initial access into the system. And that's how that whole attack chain works.
And in terms of mitigations, as probably the most repeated piece of advice that we have, make sure to patch and update as soon as viable. Easiest way to make yourself a more expensive and less attractive target. And there is some additional guidance for federal agencies that CISA references in their BOD 22-01 documentation, which is some guidance that's specific to federal services that they must follow, but can also be helpful to look at for some ideas on best practices. On this one, we've seen that there's been a acceleration in the time between a new vulnerability being disclosed and then beginning to see that vulnerability leveraged in the wild, whether that is threat actors now knowing to seek out a tool or vulnerability that they can purchase or derive it based on the details that are provided in that advisory. Do you have ideas or a perspective on why we're seeing, a nation state targeted vulnerability, usually with something held very close to the chest, used very selectively, and there was usually a fair bit of time between these often highly sophisticated attacks that hadn't been discovered before, filtering down to widespread use among criminal actors. We're seeing that time frame shorten. Do you have thoughts on why we're seeing that acceleration?
I think it's an indication of the defenders also just kind of like getting better at our jobs. This is one of those unfortunate like one of those byproducts is unfortunately like defenders and blue team we're just getting better at communicating and like how to communicate things and when to communicate them. But unfortunately, like threat actors also just have access to the internet as well, so they can also read the same things we're reading. So it's a little bit of a tough like balance to make. And obviously, like I went into this whole article trying to understand how this attack could happen, and literally was able to look it up all through Checkpoint's article. Like I could replicate this pretty easily in the lab. But at the same time, have like understanding how that works as a blue teamer defender is essential, because now I can be like, okay, well now I can watch for IE diag launching process, or I can watch for maybe like endpoints reaching out to WebDAV servers. You get more specific, so it's ultimately like it's definitely 110% better now. Like I don't want to say that, like I don't want anybody to think that like I'm saying we should stop being communicative, but this is just one of those byproducts. It's unfortunate that like they also have access. But the thing is too is like AI exists as well, so that's lowering the threshold for attackers being able to abuse such things. So even if we didn't have these details, I'm wondering almost if you could like kind of coax it out of AI if you gave it enough clues, and it wouldn't take somebody who's like really super senior to understand that. It lowers the threshold of knowledge and understanding to be able to like kind of make assumptions, and then you can kind of come out the other end with exploitable like proof of concept code. I think we even saw that in one of our recent podcast episodes where we talked about somebody generated proof of concept code just through AI, and it worked. So yeah, that's also like lowering the bar and speeding things up in terms of attackers being able to quickly turn things around on us.
Yeah, and I want to also jump on that too. I'm glad that you brought up AI. I mean, literally the other day, Jake and I were having a discussion while I was trying to replicate an attack, and had some local models running off of like a fairly mid-range card, and was able to generate a POC in about 3 minutes that worked.
Mhm.
So I think the barrier to entry is, like Jake said, far lower, but also we have to think about it from this perspective too. When we use AI for something that is supposed to be secure, we have to be very careful, and we're often trying to generate secure code. Attackers don't need to worry about that. They don't need to play by our same rules, so they can literally let it fly and just let the AI do everything if they wanted to. There are so many models out there, and local models aren't held to the same standards that your Chat GPT or Claudes are that are available online, because they have to have guardrails. But when you run it locally, you can remove those.
Yeah.
And that may be what we're seeing here. I'm not saying that is what we're seeing here, but like Jake said, it's just another tool in everyone's tool belt, but we have to use it a little bit differently than an attacker would.
Yeah, those stories are some of the first things that jump to my mind. I mean, we've seen examples of extrapolation from partial details shared in an advisory. We've seen even examples where just a vulnerability is announced and a patch is available, and people are using models to compare the change logs or the commits to determine what was changed and work backwards from that. I think we're in a situation where we're just seeing a increased asymmetry in difficulty, right? Like attackers just have to be right once and defenders have to be right every time. That is magnified by the use of AI tools, where both of those attempt rates can be exponentially increased, right? So I think it's definitely why we're seeing greater degrees of success in malicious use of AI at this stage than we're finding in complete defense. But I definitely think that's part of what's likely contributing to it. And we've got more to say about AI a little bit later today. Next up, we've got some research from Symantec looking at some pretty widely used extensions that all are transmitting data over HTTP. These are not extensions by the same developers, but they are good examples of the many ways that insecurely written extensions can pose a potential issue. So quick rundown in SEMrush rank and PI rank, those are making HTTP rather than HTTPS calls to rank.trellian.com. And those include a domain name query string. Then there's a couple more for MSN New Tab and MSN Homepage, which sends a machine ID that the extension generates unencrypted, and that could potentially work as an identifier to link multiple browsing sessions or sessions across multiple locations to the same device. Dual Safe Password Manager and Digital Vault, sending analytics and usage metrics unencrypted. Dual Safe, it should be noted, has released an update switching to using HTTPS for telemetry, which is encouraging to see. And then the last one that they mentioned was BrowseSec, which has a unencrypted uninstall URL that appends usage stats with the query. I feel like that was a little bit burying the lead, because kind of the oh yes and mention is that a lot of the domains in the host list for that extension are HTTP. So that means is folks that are connecting to use those hosts for their VPN connection, which they are likely doing as a privacy measure, is then their traffic to and from that host are going to be unencrypted. I feel like that should be a little bit more top line in the thing. But so I think that the thing that's interesting to note here is that unlike some of the other vulnerabilities that we've talked about in this and previous episodes, where we're talking about hard-coded credentials or session tokens that can basically act as that same equivalent authorization, we're largely looking at telemetry-based information here. There aren't usernames or passwords being mentioned in this list of things. However, this is a good example of several of the many ways that data can leak from those extensions. And as one example, OS information was included among that telemetry. Going back to our first story that we looked at today, knowing the cloud platform and a software version of that ISE deployment could be used to determine the default credentials for it. So even those relatively low level, less private pieces of information can be important intel for attackers. So, uh, what are some other examples of why unencrypted traffic channels like this in extensions pose a security concern? We've talked about zombie extensions, but less so about insecurely coded legitimate extensions before on the show.
The first thing I want to say about this is like, just because you like the data that you're like leaking or get like the attacker has access to stuff like OS version or like ports that are running on your computer, that's like step one for any attacker. Like if you do hack the box or try hack me or any stuff like that, that's like first step is understanding what you're attacking, because then you can start to understand like, okay, well, let me try throwing this at it, let me try seeing what's on this port. So just because that information is not like really like assumed by most people to be like information that needs to be secured, it is kind of like on a need to know basis. It's not stopping Windows from just like spewing that information out to the network every which way. But at the same time, there is some like ramifications to leaking data like that. Another thing I wanted to mention too is, and we touched on a little about the VPNs. You have to really be careful about what VPNs you're signing up for. And I think I saw it recently. I don't remember where, but there was the Rick and Morty meme about like, let's just say you don't pay with money. That's the same
Mhm.
thing with some of these VPNs. Like you're paying with stuff that you might getting a VPN for cheap or for free. But yeah, you're paying for it with like probably your data. But yeah, so those are the things to keep a lookout for. In this case, like you said, Zoe, they've got HTTP domains, so you really have to be like have to scrutinize the VPN services that you're signing up for. This is just one of those things that I've seen gone rampant, and rampant is just VPN services popping up left and right. And just because it's a VPN service doesn't mean it's secure, doesn't mean it's protecting your data. They could say all these things. And the best way to protect yourself from that is just trying to stay away from these low reputation, low, like if you've never heard of it, try to stay away from it. Like if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. So that's kind of how you can safeguard yourself. So just try to stick with like the big name VPN providers, like private. What was the name of the
Private
private
internet
IP?
access.
Yeah, private internet access would be one of them. But just the big ones. I mean, they've got problems of their own as well, but probably less so, hopefully, than these smaller ones. But yeah, specifically in terms of extensions using unencrypted traffic channels, that just doesn't that I don't know. That doesn't seem right for this day and age. I feel like we should be past that. And
Truly.
this like API keys basically are creds. They might not be your user creds. So like if I as a user am using your extension that's leaking your API creds, there's nothing to stop an attacker from stealing those. And then who knows, they can use those API creds to just access the entire database of everybody's creds. So it might not be like directly compromising my creds, but there's nothing to stop me from assuming that those API creds couldn't be used to exploit a database somewhere or be used some other way. And in fact, API creds are almost, or keys are almost more usable than password creds, because then you don't need a username. You don't like username and password. At least you need two things. Whereas API keys is just kind of like you've got all the authentication that you need. But yeah, I just wanted to be very clear. Having control over your browser extensions, especially in like a corporate or like a bring your own device kind of environment, is essential. There's a lot of malware in those things. I'm not even talking about insecurely developed extensions. I'm just talking about like straight malware extensions. There's tons of them. Like the extension like store for all of the browsers, I feel like it's like a best effort kind of like scanning thing. I don't think like Chrome or Firefox really go through or vet those all that much. I think they try, but it's just too many and too many things going on. So yeah, it's just one of those things that you really have to be careful with, because most of the time they're just going to be outright malware, and you just don't know what else they could be transmitting, let alone if it's in an encrypted channel or not.
Yeah, I've already withheld myself from a GI Joe reference that knowing is half the battle, but I do feel like I have to misappropriate the Karate Kid Cobra Kai wisdom. If you can't recon, you can't attack, right? So it's a good thing to remember. And if you can't inventory, you can't really defend either. So it works on both sides there.
Yeah, what came to mind too was we have this idea of the principle of least privilege. I think we should all adopt the principle of the least amount of extensions to install that you need to do whatever it is that you need to do. I try to keep all of my browsers lean with like a max of like 2 to 3 extensions, and really, they're extensions that are generally from reputable companies. Not saying that the ones that listed in here weren't from reputable companies, because they were. And mistakes happen, coding mistakes happen. I know we talked a little bit about that earlier, but yeah, I would focus on just limiting the amount of extensions you're using. The browser is now, like, I mean, for companies that use Google Workspace, the browser is everything. You access the browser to do all of your documents, sharing files, email. If an extension has full access to every page you're visiting, well, it has full access to read everything in that page too. So just browser control. We've been hearing a lot of talk about these enterprise level browsers, and these browsers having enterprise functionality. I think this is what it means, is being able to audit, be aware of, and control the extensions that your users are adding into their browsers.
Yeah, it kind of brings me back to the days of the toolbars. Just trying to go for the
Yeah.
highest score and see how many toolbars you could have installed, and before you know it, you've got like maybe an inch of screen left on your Internet Explorer.
It is also worth a mention. It is also worth a mention that the more extensions you have installed, the more unique your configuration of your browser is, the easier it is to have a fingerprint where there's a fair number of extensions that can have permissions to see what other extensions are installed. And so that's a privacy consideration to keep in mind as well. It pains me to skip our AI hallucination story, but I want to make sure we get to talk about this Play Ransomware advisory update. So I think I'll still include the hallucination story, because I do think this is something that we need to be talking about, as well as the data sharing risks that we've covered before. But I do want to touch on, before we close today, updated guidance that came from CISA and the Australian advisory agency, I believe, too, on updating their guidance on Play Ransomware, which we've been seeing since 2023, I believe, 22. And this advisory, I think, is valuable and well worth checking out, because it gives some good details on TTPs, tools, tactics, and procedures or processes. And so these go through the stages of the attack chain, going from initial access with methods including buying accounts, exploiting public-facing applications, in particular FortiOS and Exchange vulnerabilities that are called out by their CVEs in the advisory, along with RDP or VPN for remote access. More recently, for those remote access use, they're seeing more frequency misuse of Simple Help RMM after the January disclosure of a vulnerability in that tool. In discovery and evasion, add find for querying AD, Grixba to enumerate network info, using tools like GMER, IOBit, PowerTool to disable antivirus and remove logs, making it harder to investigate. And then the use of PowerShell scripts that are targeting Microsoft Defender. At the lateral movement and escalation stage, again, another mention of Cobalt Strike, and as well as System BC tools. PS exec being misused, I should say, for lateral movement. So a misuse of a legitimate tool, not really a lull bin, because it's not a system default tool, but it is a Microsoft created tool. Looking for unsecured credentials, using tools like Mimikatz to dump credentials, try and gain admin access. and then a mention of Windows Privilege Escalation Awesome Scripts, or WinPs, for finding other privilege escalation paths. Love it when terribly malicious tools have really cute names. And then an update in exfiltration and encryption, noting that it is recompiled for every attack, resulting in unique hashes, making AV detection difficult. And for those that are less familiar with AV technologies and how those things have developed, we saw initially very specific signature-based AV detection, which you would see a relatively low level of false positives, but you'd miss a lot because if you didn't have a signature, you'd miss it. And ever since, we've seen a kind of back and forth shift of you're never going to hit that absolutely perfect target of no false positives and catching everything that's malicious. But you can go back and forth. And increasingly, we see a focus on behavioral analysis because it has become so trivially easy to make those changes that will prevent hash-based detection. Jake, I know you've got some things you wanted to point out here, but basically I wanted to open it up. I don't think that any of these are certainly not unique tactics, and I think also pretty widely seen tools. We've already mentioned Cobalt Strike today. What can folks learn from this that they may see, if not in a play ransomware attack, in some of the other common attacks that we see out in the wild right now?
Yeah, I wanted to say first, if you think WinPeas is a cute name, you should also look at their logo. The GitHub page has just really cute art for their little peas in a pod. They also do ASCII art if you're running it in CLI too, and it's really great. But that was just an honorable mention I wanted to drop. But yeah, that is also something if you wanted to play around with WinPeas or even understand more about it. That is a publicly accessible tool that you could get and download and run yourself in safe environments. But yeah, the things that I wanted to bring up, I wanted to highlight a lot of the either some really big items or just the updates that they brought up. The most important one that just kind of kicks us all off is the valid accounts. So we're not always just seeing attackers get in through brute forcing or guessing passwords. A lot of times they're just buying the accounts that have access. So you won't really see anything abnormal from somebody logging in. But that's kind of where the whole idea of zero trust came from, is just kind of at each step of request that a user has, they should be checked. I'm not saying that everybody goes out and starts applying zero trust. I don't know if we're over or past that fad in this industry, but it does have some merits, obviously. But you should be able to just because you see a user logging in and you don't see any credential brute forcing, or you don't see anything else, you just should know at least keep in the back of your mind are they accessing things they shouldn't, or they typically aren't. That's again where the UE or end user behavior, I always forget the acronym for it,
User
but
endpoint behavior analytics, I believe.
yeah, right, the EUBA stuff, that's where that comes from. And just understanding what is the user normally doing on their day to day. Does this differentiate that? Are they doing anything outside of that normal day to day? So that's another one of those things. Just keep an eye out for. Just because you don't see somebody brute forcing their way in doesn't mean an attacker didn't buy their way in through another account. This is also a good argument for making sure you've got MFA. I think we say this on every episode. MFA gets mentioned, but it's still something that people are needing to enable if you haven't done it already, or at least some other kind of identity verification defense. And again, yeah, like I said, zero trust is kind of based off of that idea, and just trying to provide checks at every step. Fortinet was mentioned specifically in this alert. I don't want to dump on them because I think security is hard. It's just hard for everybody. I know they've had a lot of trouble recently. I don't know if they've just got a shortage with resources being able to help them out. But long story short, I'm not saying people should just get rid of them, remove them. That's good advice for some people, but some other people that's just not an option. And in that case, you should be playbooking and tabletopping for these kind of events, just because we know Fortinet has had their issues in the past. So there's a good chance probably in the next 6 to 12 months, there's going to be another Fortinet thing. Just kind of plan for that. You don't need to have like all of the pieces together, but just make like look at the last like I don't know 3 or 4 or even just like 1 or 2 exploits that have gone out on Fortinet and just be like, if this happened to me, if this affected me, how would I respond to it? Do I have all the right pieces to respond to it? And just like making sure you've got all those things covered. And if you were affected by those, the last few, like understand like how did it go for you? Were you able to patch in time? Like always try to do like a retro when these things happen, so you can kind of understand uh, what it's going to be like next time. Because at this point, there's probably going to be a next time. It would be on you if you assumed that there wouldn't be a next time. So, and that's true for any, not even just Fortinet or any of their process or products. Like this is true for anything. Um, and then let's see here, what do I got for other notes? So the other thing that I wanted to call out was they said that the play ransomware binary was being recompiled for every attack, resulting in unique hashes for each deployment, complicating anti-malware and antivirus program detection of the ransomware. So I wanted to give another mention. I think I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but the pyramid of pain hashes happen to be on the very bottom section of the pyramid of pain, and that means that they're literally the easiest thing for attackers to change. So it's literally it's so trivial for them to change a hash. Um, it's not reliable to just like watch for hashes all the time. And then conversely, on the highest point on the pyramid of pain is the TTPs, like we were just saying. So the more often we can target and detect things that attackers are doing when they get access to a box, that's like, okay, I've got access to a box. I'm going to run discovery commands. I'm going to figure out what account I'm under. What can I do to escalate my privileges? Those are things that a lot of times they're doing the same thing. Regardless of how they got into an environment, they're running discovery commands. They're trying to move laterally. It's the initial access that can be kind of like hard to nail down. But once you get after that, it's like once they're in the network, they're doing the same thing over and over again. So it behooves us as detection engineers to focus more on those TTPs, because over time they're going to catch more and more behavior, and they're just going to be consistent, and they're going to require less time for us to go back and look at those, because they're just going to keep constantly catching things, and we don't even really need to go back and maintain them, because the threat actors are just going to keep using those same those tactics.
Great points. Anything we want to make sure to leave folks with today as we get to the end of our list to close out another exciting week of security news?
I did want to just touch on one last thing for that last story, and I think this is I'll leave it to Justin after this, but one thing I wanted to make it clear too, and that I really liked in CISA's recommendations, was they had a little section about validating security controls. It's not enough anymore just to have these tools and processes and procedures in place to keep yourself protected. You have to be testing those things. Just because you've got backups of things, like have you tried restoring from the backup? Like, is the backup really even working if you're not testing it all the time? But yeah, they're just saying like, you've got all these things in place, start testing them, go one by one, be like, okay, we've got backups in place, what does it look like, how often are we backing up, what does it look like if something gets infected, can we restore from a backup, how fast is that restoration? So just like kind of go a step deeper. Now that you've got all these things deployed to protect yourselves, make sure that you know how they work, you know what they're like, what protection they're providing your environment, and just identifying gaps and just like making sure you know like how you're protecting your environment.
Yeah, would just want to add to when Jake, you brought up, and I know CISA had some guidance on this as well with the last story, to enable multi-factor authentication. Don't just think that by enabling it, and I think Zoe, we talked about this too last session, enabling MFA is not enough anymore. You need to make sure you are enabling phish resistant MFA. You need to also make sure that any backup MFA options are not related to particularly vulnerable methods. For instance, like SMS. Because I think, Zoe, you said this really well last time, was that your MFA is only as strong as your
Weakest
weakest
backup option.
backup
Yeah.
method. And I just thought that's such a good like quote to live by, even for somebody like me who's been doing this for a while. It's excellent word choice, and that would be the biggest thing for me to harp on and add on to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think hand in hand with the identity focus and attacks we've seen, as we've seen identity security respond by going from you should be using multi-factor to you have to use multi-factor increasingly. We're going to see more of a focus on trying to bypass multi-factor. We saw a surge in push fatigue attacks, because for a good long while, push was one of the best alternatives to using things like passcode generators or SMS. I'm not even going to mention email because I have strong feelings about calling an email code 2FA. So, well, I think we're going to wrap it here for this week. We had a ton to talk about. Didn't even get to it all, but we will include links to all of the original stories in the resources. As always, we welcome your feedback and questions on what you'd like to see us cover in future episodes. Subscribe, alert, like. I think those are all the key words. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Justin and Jake, for lending us your expertise. And until next time, everybody, stay safe out there. Bye-bye.